battle come down.
Now, war is declared and battle come down, sings Joe Strummer. We shall see what mood Simon Stevens is in after tomorrow's budget. After that tour of the moral high ground from Terence, I'm going to drag you back down into the sordid world of politics and policy. As said, there is an awful lot to talk about, so I've just picked 3 themes. Let's talk about money, and let's talk about what we should look for in tomorrow's budget. Capital revenue pay. Capital. Now, we know capital is coming. Why do we know it? Because the Chancellor did a very strange thing in his spring budget and said he was going to do it. Very rare for a Chancellor to say what they're going to do in the next budget. And we know that a spooked Theresa May blurted out the £10 billion number when she was under pressure during the general election campaign. So, got a reasonable assumption that it's coming. Of course, we don't know exactly how much it'll be until tomorrow. £10 billion was the figure that Theresa May quoted. I think she probably got that from the Naylor report. I'm pretty sure she did. It's very important where it comes from. And it's particularly important where it comes from because of the timing of it, the timing of when that money might arrive. If it comes from the Treasury, it can arrive tomorrow. If it comes from the disposal of land or buildings that the NHS owns, or through the development of joint venture programmes, as both suggested in the Naylor report, Naylor review, then it's going to take longer to arrive. So it will be very important to see where it comes from, because if they say we're going to give £10 billion worth of capital, but the NHS has to raise half of it, that tells you something about how quickly that whole 10 billion might arrive. And I think this goes in specifically for capital, but it might go more generally. I'm hearing some interesting things about it. Is there's going to be loads of strings attached. The Treasury does not. I'll come on to this in a minute. The Treasury has always believed, not just this. It's not the government. It's the Treasury believes that the NHS is a black hole. That every time you give it more money, it sucks it all up in an instant and comes back and says, can we have some more, please? So if it's going to give, in this particularly tight economic environment, some more money, it's going to attach a lot of strings. And on the revenue point, I think what the manifesto, the Tory Party manifesto said, that we would give £8 billion in this, extra £8 billion in the course of this Parliament, and it would be a real terms increase in every financial year of that Parliament. Because inflation has gone up since the last spending review, to honour that pledge, they need to push up the funding settlement in 18-19 and 19-20 a little bit to get them above that real terms test. But that's hundreds of millions, not the billions that everyone who's looked at it at an independent point of view knows that they need. I wonder, and we'll only know tomorrow, if what we might see is some kind of fund for the birthday present for the NHS's 70th birthday, which is over and above that manifesto commitment, but also says, and the NHS will meet some new set of targets or recover some existing set of targets that it's not meeting at the moment. In other words, little reflection of the underlying pressures that need to be met before the NHS might tackle those goals. Again, the shape of any revenue investment is important. We know the next two years are particularly tight. And also, but that leads me on to my third point, which is where it's going to be from. Are they going to suck money? We get the funding goes up a bit, ticks up a bit towards years of 4 and 5 of the spending review period. Are they going to suck money from that period? Or are they, and I suspect this is highly likely, are they likely to raid, so you have the NHS budget, sort of about 100 odd million, 90 odd million, and then you have the health budget, which adds about another 20 million on that. Are they going to raid the health budget, public health, admin costs, etc., to suck some more revenue funds into the NHS? I suspect that is highly likely. And then in a more general point, I'm very interested to see what the Chancellor has to say, and more particularly the various Treasury documents come out, about sort of future increases, because this is not a one-off thing. You know, Simon Stevens has been locked in a sort of ongoing funding debate with the Treasury ever since the spending review, ever since the publication of the 5-year forward review. People sometimes criticise him for not asking for enough money in that original spending review, but it was always only ever going to be the start of a conversation in a period of austerity. And so we're looking to see what other increases in revenue funding particularly might be coming, particularly in relation to Brexit. Has the Stevens gambit of bringing in the Brexit bus at the providers' conference worked or not? And also particularly on ACOs, there's the Treasury was very spooked by the OBR report, Office of Budget Responsibility report, a while ago, in which which talked about by 2026, which isn't that long away, healthcare consuming 1 in every £2 that the government collects, and that's a really spooky thing for the Treasury, because of that 50% that's remaining outside health, there's some stuff there's a lot of it that isn't discretionary, and so if health spending rises to that level, the ability of the Treasury to do anything strategic is almost taken away. They're just effectively a banking function, moving money from taxes to spending. So they want to find a way to do that. And at the moment, they're trying very, very hard to believe in accountable care organisations as the way to do that. So we shall wait and see if there are. So those are all the things that I suggest that you might look for. GS1 is about patient safety. It's all about efficiency. So I wanted to talk a little bit about that. You'll hear Simon Stevens and Jeremy Hunt and others, maybe even Matthew will mention it today, talk about the NHS, making the NHS an investable proposition, giving the Treasury confidence, as per my previous points, that it isn't just pouring money down a black hole. I think that the desire, they want some overt signals to do that, as well as the sort of ground level granular work, and therefore I suggest that sort of driving not merger activity for the sake of it, but being able to demonstrate to Treasury and other government that organisations are not duplicating work will be important, and I think that will drive the establishment of hospital chains and CCG alliances, by which I mean initially sharing accountable officers and other backroom staff, and then eventually mergers. Now, we've been talking about efficiency in the NHS since the financial crash and the McKinsey report that produced the initial gap between NHS need and projected funding. That conversation for the first 5 or 6 years was incredibly data light. But we are now actually getting some sort of decent data on efficiency. It's hugely varied, but some of the stuff in the model hospital is pretty good. and there's a lot of central collection of data going on. It's dirty and noisy at the moment. It's going to get better. And that is partly because there are now a series of focused and funded efficiency programs with top-level backing. The ones that I particularly pick out, but there are many others, are the Getting It Right First Time program. I think you're hearing from Tim Briggs tomorrow. Is it Tim? No, he's not. All right, okay. Anyway, Getting It Right First Time program, which is now across a range of something like 17 or 18 different, maybe more, different programs, started with orthopedics, of course. And the work, the Product Purchasing Index Benchmarking, PBIB, which I think is very, very significant, and having a massive impact on the information asymmetry on pricing between the NHS and suppliers. It was previously the place that suppliers knew anything, NHS knew nothing. It's almost the other way round now, because now the NHS, through this work, can see what it's paying for everything across all organisations, which makes comparisons very easy. And it's just a good example of the fact that the efficiency nettle is, they're really trying their hardest to grasp it. Regardless of what happens on tomorrow in terms of the funding, regardless if we get a general election and a Labour government, none of the governments, none of this country's potential governments, judging by the 2017 manifestos, are going to put in any level of money that would mean austerity would go away. So this is going to continue for a long time, for the foreseeable future, at least for the next 2 years, and for probably I would say for the next 4 or 5 years. So it needs to be mainstreamed in people's thinking, and I think increasingly has been. There's a lot of work going on here, around improving the efficiency of how the NHS buys stuff. I know lots of people have tried it lots of times beforehand, but there seems to be a stronger logic and a greater focus on it this time, tied in with the efficiency drive. And again, this desire to demonstrate the NHS as an investable proposition. We'll see how the procurement towers work, or don't. But the recent move by NHS England to set up this sort of framework to buy technology and buy support services for developing ACOs and for the Global Digital Exemplar programme. Matthew may well indeed talk about this as that. It's all a sign of trying to get a grip on the procurement progress. As part of that, there's been a much greater focus on return on investment, and particularly short-term return on investment, in how the NHS purchases. And what that's going to produce, I think, is an environment for suppliers and for NHS organisations that is more challenging. Buying things is going to have to be a more thoughtful process than it had been in the past, and maybe a more challenging one at the moment. But it could settle down into a situation in which is more transparent and navigable for suppliers, for both suppliers and the NHS. But I expect there will be quite a few bumps along the way. This is a conference about patient safety above all else, so I wanted to finish on this particular note. I've sort of tied patient safety and performance together. Now, we've got the new CQC inspections rolling out. I saw David Dalton last week, and Salford was one of the first ones to go through that process. It's interesting, I talked to policymakers and chief execs about the CQC process. It's both a sword and a shield. I mean, the sword side of things, particularly on the sort of, is not only on the quality side of the analysis, are you delivering high enough quality, but also now, because they're about to introduce an efficiency rating, are you doing so efficiently? But it is also increasingly, a lot of people in this room will be aware of that the new CQC, as I still think of it, even though it's been going 5 or 6 years, had a difficult birth. But now actually it's emerging as probably the most robust of the system managers within the NHS. And its findings are actually quite hard to attack. So if you're somebody from the Treasury, say, and you're suggesting that cuts need to be made or efficiencies need to be made, having a CQC report saying such things would endanger patient safety is a very powerful piece of evidence. We have HSIB, the new investigation body. They've been telling us that their particular target is not individual NHS organisations, but the system and system regulators. Is the system being run in a way which is likely to lead to quality outcomes and particularly safe outcomes? And that, as these reports begin to roll out, I think they'll have an important impact on the weather of this constant weighing between patient safety, quality and cost issues. There's an uneasy alliance between NHS England and NHS Improvement, which affects the whole issue of patient safety and performance. The chief executives and finance directors will be very familiar with NHS Improvement turning up one day and telling them to maximise their activities so as to drive down their deficit, and then NHS England turning up the next day and asking them whether they wouldn't mind freezing their elective activity for a few weeks so that CCGs could get themselves into a better financial state of mind. Now, I don't think that tension is going away anyway soon. Sadly, the government is going to continue with the rather silly idea of appointing a separate idea of an NHS Improvement chief executive, even though everybody has turned it down. Eventually, somebody's arm will get twisted so far up their back that they will actually have to say yes to it. But that tension between the two, I think, is something which is, it illustrates the real tension in the system at the moment between quality and finance issues, something that many in the audience are having to live with on a day-by-day basis. If I look at access targets, you would think that something would have to give, wouldn't you? And the most interesting line within Simon Stevens' speech last at the Providers Conference was this idea that the government, to quote him exactly, may be publicly, legally, two important words, required to end the patient guarantees of 4-hour waiting times, RTT, cancer, etc. Those are in statute. And that's really, really significant. And we'll see if the budget reflects this. But you know, there's focus on A&E at the moment, but elective waiting times are getting longer and longer. How are they going to balance that out? And what happens if there is some kind of change in the commitment? I really encourage you to watch that closely. But there are positive things to point at as well. We reported this yesterday, how that the vanguard areas do seem to be getting on top of controlling emergency admissions. It's very early days. It's very dirty data, but it does seem to be that there is some evidence that the new care models that are being developed are working. And when push comes to shove, just to end on a note that I think is appropriate for this conference, I think that there is a determination within the local NHS, trust leaderships, etc., that if they're going to be hung, they'd rather be hung for finance sins rather than quality or patient safety ones. Thanks very much.